tonight is about getting rid of the ego, or working with the ego. And you know, what brought this on was it's been an interesting trail of many occurrences in the last couple of weeks where I saw a lot of ego arising, not only within myself but within others. Got a really long email last week of exactly how this nonprofit is supposed to be run and exactly what I'm supposed to be doing and all that I'm doing wrong. And I get things like this regularly. I get people who deem themselves experts who are going to tell me the way things, how a spiritual organization and the Dharma is to be portrayed. So I have to look at my own ego when it's arising, what it thinks it knows, and work with that as skillfully as I can, as well as what might be valuable in the communications and what might not be valuable. And to have compassion for a lot of ego that's coming up. Then last week in my inbox I got you may have seen this study, I think it was reported in Mindful, this psychological study published by the University of Southampton that they found, the researchers found that contemporary meditation and yoga practices actually inflated the ego, didn't deflate it. Anybody see that article? Yeah, and their argument was that practicing any skill has a tendency to inflate one's sense of self-regard. And, you know, I've seen it within myself and I've seen it within others. It's called spiritual materialism. They now have a word for it. In that we can, if we have a tendency to have an inflated ego, we can take anything, even our spiritual practices, and use that, whatever benefits we've gotten from our practice, to build up our sense of importance or our sense of self. That ego is amazing how it just gets in there and does its stuff. So we have to constantly be checking our ego. Right? At one point I was going to put a note on the door that said, leave your ego outside of the outside. But anyhow, so they had me thinking about, well, what about the ego, and how do we work with it? You know, and what enhances the ego? What reduces the ego? What is an ego? What is a healthy sense of ego? You know, a lot of people come to spiritual practice and they sit with me and say, well, I'm here because I want to get rid of my ego. Like, it's gone. Right? Here's Suzuki Roshi. Someone asked him, how much ego do you need? And his answer was, just enough so that you don't step in front of a bus. Right? So what do I mean by ego? Everybody means something different. And I'm not a psychologist. I don't have a therapeutic background. I tend to look at the ego like it's our sense of small self. It's the part of our mind that deals with the material world, with the world of form, like the conceptual mind, the part of us that keeps us safe and helps us navigate through life. Right? So with this description of, my description of the ego, you really can't get rid of the ego. Because you're not going to be able to survive, couldn't function without it, right? It differentiates me from someone else. It has me be able to know that these are my feelings, not someone else's feelings. It has me set healthy boundaries, have hopefully healthy relationships, and on and on and on. And by the way, this is one question I like to ask people. Who is it that wants to get rid of the ego?
The ego.
Exactly, right? It's the ego wanting to get rid of itself. So are we diminishing the ego when we're trying to excise it? We're actually strengthening it. So it's not about getting rid of the ego, right? It is trying to stop grasping at the ego, stop identifying with this small sense of self, this small sense of ego self. And it's about developing a healthy sense of self, and then moving on to the bigger self, our true nature, right? And I'll talk more about that. So, like many of us, I was raised to not have a healthy sense of ego. I was raised to be arrogant, conceited, to not be humble. At least some of the examples I was given growing up. I was taught that I had to be number one in everything that I did, or I was failing. I was bred to compare and to compete, which led to a lot of conceit and ridicule and strengthening the inner judge and a lot of inner suffering. A lot of suffering. A lot of perfectionism and never being enough, and really strengthening that small sense of self. Fear of failure was extremely predominant in my experience, because if I failed, I wasn't worthy of existing. So I had a lot of these patterns to really look at when I started my spiritual practice and be like, whoa, is this helpful? You know, and saw how I kept solidifying this small sense of self that was really suffering. So what we learn is that conceit and arrogance are destructive mind habit patterns that we really need to look at. We need to see clearly and learn how to work with compassion. Without this conceit and arrogance, our true nature is one of humility and wisdom and beauty and love. Right? Kristen Neff, some of you may have heard of her. She's a compassion researcher, a psychologist. She's really interesting. In fact, I played a couple of videos of hers. But she has this one TED Talk video where she talks about self-esteem. She's researched compassion and self-esteem. And she says that self-esteem actually is what causes us so much suffering, this pressure on us to develop self-esteem. Because she said that in order to have self-esteem, you have to feel better than the average person. Right? And so everybody who's trying to have good, healthy self-esteem is trying to feel better than everybody else. And so she's saying that it breeds this environment where we have to put other people down so that we can feel better than them, so that we can have self-esteem. And that this is causing a lot of problems. She said it's the root of all the, they think it's the root of all the bullying that's happening now. These kids are bullying others to feel better about themselves. So this is ego stuff, right? Building up our own sense of ego so that we can feel better about ourselves and put everyone else down. I would say, maybe I'm off, but I would say that our society is pretty ego-based. Anybody agree with me here? Any hands? No, right? And I talk about these three ego-based motivations a lot. The three primary ones, roots, are to look good, to be right, and to be in control. Right? And if we are identified with any of those three ego-based needs, then we're going to suffer. We're going to cause suffering for others too, usually. Right? I heard the news today. I was just hearing the end of this news program on NPR about how these political groups got together and they were trying to resolve some major issue, but they didn't get anywhere because the two groups ended up standing up screaming at each other. Did you hear that news report? I was like, what? Perfect timing. I mean, it's all about ego, right? What are they trying, if they're standing up all screaming at each other, what are they trying to do?
Be right.
Be right?
Be better.
Be better? Be in control, right? Are we going to get anywhere? How far are we going to get? We're going to cause a lot more suffering for ourselves and others when we're coming from these ego, out of unhealthy ego motivations. And it starts young. We're wired pretty young. Here's a story that I found. A kindergartner teacher was observing the children while they drew their art. The teacher would occasionally walk around to see each child's work. As she got to where one little girl was working diligently, the teacher asked what the girl was drawing. The girl replied, "I'm drawing God." The teacher paused and said, "But honey, no one knows what God looks like." Without missing a beat or looking up from her drawing, the little girl replied, "They will in a minute." Yeah, she was started out pretty young, wasn't she? You know, I taught Taekwondo for years, and I love teaching the kids. You may have heard me say this before. Because the kids were out there, and they were punching and kicking and totally doing it wrong, but they had big smiles on their faces. They were going for it. They had no idea what they were doing, but they were passionately going for it. But then in the adult classes, the adults were tight, and they were contracted, and they were scared, and they were afraid to, key up as the spirit yell, and they were afraid to do any of their moves. They were so controlled. Is this right? Is that wrong? They were nervous wrecks, because they were afraid that they were going to look bad and do it wrong. Instead of just going out there like the little kids and doing it wrong, but doing it passionately. Anyhow, and that's what I kept telling them. If you're going to screw up big. Just do it. So in Buddhism, conceit of the self is said to be the last of the great obstacles to full awakening. The conceit of the self. Conceit is one of the 14 unwholesome mental factors, along with, do you want to hear the other ones? Delusion, lack of shame, disregard for consequence, restlessness, greed, wrong view, hatred, envy, miserliness, regret, sloth and torpor, and doubt. So conceit is considered one of the mental fetters that help keep us in bondage to suffering. And to me, I'm looking at conceit as an unhealthy ego, either inflated or deflated. The Buddha said there are 3 types of conceit. Same as, less than, or better than. Right? So conceit manifests in the feelings that I'm better than, or someone else is better than, or I'm worse than, or someone else is worse than, or I'm equal to, or someone else is equal to. And out of this conceit comes all of the suffering and the tormenting that we do of ourselves, and the whole world comes from these, the comparing, the evaluating, the judging, the attacking, the needing to be better than, or right, or prove a point. All of the envy and jealousy and resentment and right? They all come out of this sense of the duality of the self, this conceit of the self. And it's the root of amazing alienation. Not only alienation with ourselves, alienation with each other. Whenever someone projects that we're better than, or they're better than, or worse than. This is all conceit. And what's interesting is the Buddha even called the deflated ego conceit. So whether it's inflated or deflated, it's still considered conceit. This comparison is still considered conceit. So our commitment to awaken requires us to honestly explore what the mind is doing, and if it's making these evaluations and judgments, and if it's stuck in either inflated or deflated ego and conceit, whether we're trying to inflate our own ego by putting someone else down, whether it's conscious or unconscious. We need to look at all of these things, how we relate to the world, how we relate to each other. The other day at the book club, I got an example of looking at my ego. And, someone made a statement, and I disagreed, and I, was bringing out Buddhist terminology in my own experience. And this man in the book club pretty much came out and told me, "You're wrong." And he was very emphatic about how I was wrong and he was right. And he made his point. Well, I'm sitting there and I could feel, ego jumping to the forefront, wanting to, tell him, "Who do you think you are?" Telling me that I'm, what I mean. I wanted to argue with him and show him how he's, all the ways that he was wrong and I was right. But then since I felt this amazing amount of suffering and this really strong sense of self come up that wanted to be defended, and I said, "Oh, okay, this is really an unhealthy place to be." So I brought my energy and I pulled it in, and I started to notice how much I was suffering. And then I was watching him talking, and I saw how much he was suffering because he was needing to be right. And I just started taking care of my heart, taking care of feeling the sensations in my chest, my body, my belly. And I chose to just not say anything more for a while and take care of myself. Right? Because I was in an inflated ego state of mind, and nothing healthy is going to come out of that. Right? So to me, that's a call that I need to take care of myself, that I'm in an imbalanced place, that I've become really solidified or attached to my view of how I think things should be. I was shitting on myself. Yeah. So we need to bring our awareness to this suffering when the suffering's arising, see what we're clinging to. Right? I was clinging to needing to be right about this. And what's really interesting is one person's ego comes up. What does it do? It's like, it calls everyone else's ego up. Anybody notice that watching politics lately? Right? It's one of us, hopefully one of us on a spiritual path, the spiritual path, who's doing self-awareness practices, will, from time to time be able to say, "Oh wow, this is a really painful, I'm suffering a lot here. I'm going to stop this cycle of pain." And it starts here, right here. It's not going to start over there by us trying to control or condemn or project our pain onto the other person, right? Tell them what they need to do. When we project our pain onto others, it's because we're unwilling to be with our own pain. Right? We're unwilling to be with our own ego pain, our own clinging, our own suffering. Thich Nhat Hanh, of letting go of our individual ideas and notions to embrace and become one with another person or our entire community. When we're proud, we can be easily wounded. We are like the tall, dry grasses that don't bend low in the face of the winds. Instead, they try to remain standing tall and in the process are broken to shreds. Our pride is an obstacle to developing our understanding, compassion, and boundless love. When we're humble, we have nothing to fear, nothing to lose. We easily flow with the circumstances that we find ourselves in and are endlessly open to learning, to practicing, and to transforming ourselves. Easier said than done. But that's our practice. Who said it was going to be easy? Who said it was going to be painless? Certainly not me. So Buddhism, in its approach to the ego, doesn't make the ego bad and wrong. It doesn't say to get rid of the the ego. It puts the emphasis on not clinging to any function of the mind, the heart, or the body. And it points to this selflessness, this egolessness, the not self that we often start to talk about. But egolessness does not mean the absence of a functional self. That would be psychotic. Right? Something is still existing, some sense of something here is still existing, sense of beingness. But it means we're no longer identified with this small sense of self, the one that we construct with all of our beliefs and our ideas and our expertise and what we think we know. But we have to constantly defend and condone and protect. Okay, so these are the areas where we need to look at. When are we arrogant? When are we inflexible? When do we get, feel that, right? That's an invitation to see what we're clinging to. What sense of self are we needing to defend? Right? When we go into hyper-control, what pain are we not willing to be within ourselves? Right? It doesn't mean that we condone unacceptable behavior. It doesn't mean that we don't stand up and set healthy boundaries when we feel people are being hurtful. It just means that we're not, hopefully we're doing it in a healthy way, not from an inflated ego or a deflated ego place. That we've done our own healing, we've looked at our own pain, we've been able to sit with it until we get to this place of what's underneath all of that. Once we're with our own pain, what's underneath that? Our true nature. We move from the small sense of self to the big sense of self. The boundless, the spacious, the loving, the accepting, the compassionate being that sees the pain and suffering of others without condemning them, but knows their pain and suffering and has compassion for them because we've been able to be with our own pain and suffering. We've moved through the bowels of hell and we've survived. Right? That's where compassion comes from. And all of these great yogis, saints, and sages have accomplished amazing things in helping us connect to our own hearts and our religions. Not because they didn't have an ego. They had to have a pretty strong ego to stand up and say what was true for them in their spiritual lives. But they weren't bound by their small sense of self. They weren't bound by the inflated or deflated ego. They were able to plug into something greater than their small sense of self. Right? So they were able to use their ego in order to move them into their big sense of self, their higher true nature. Saint Teresa was considered a great contemplative, the only woman ever known to reform the entire Catholic monastic tradition. Gautama Buddha, whom I talk about, shook India with his new teachings, totally, right out of their foundation. We look at other greats like Rumi, Lao Tzu, Plato. They started revolutions in the spiritual realm and in the internal contemplative realms that lasted hundreds, even thousands of years. And they did that not because they became dead from the neck down or because they got rid of their ego. Right? They did it because they were able to plug into something greater, straight into God, or whatever you want to call this true nature of ours that we're able to plug into. What's ironic is the purpose of the spiritual life is to eventually give up seeking. We start by seeking, but if we continue down this path, we end up letting go of the seeker. and fall into this larger sense of self. Because we get to see that all this seeking is just more suffering, causing us more suffering, trying to get something. We're not going to get anything by trying to get it. It's by relinquishing and letting go that we end up falling into the bigger sense of self. So we don't want to get rid of the ego. We want to inhabit it fully. We want to have a healthy relationship with it. We want to see it clearly. We want to heal whatever needs to be healed so that it can be healthy. Right? And in doing so, after we're able to be with whatever is stopping us from being whole, we'll drop into that primordial sense of the witness, or the bigger self. And we'll be able to reside there for longer and longer periods of time, as long as we continue our practice. This is D.H. Lawrence. When we get out of the glass bottles of our ego, and when we escape like squirrels turning in the cages of our personality and get into the forests again, we shall shiver with cold and fright. The things will happen to us so that we don't know ourselves. Cool, unlying life will rush in, and passion will make our bodies taut with power. We shall stamp our feet with new power, and old things will fall down. We shall laugh, and institutions will curl up like burnt paper. So that's just scratching the surface of working with the ego, and there's so much more that there's always so much more, and each moment will give you an opportunity to work with it, right? But hopefully you have the support of Sangha with other spiritual friends, and thank you for your deep listening in your practice.